In terms of a person's life, each person at the time that he's born, he's allocated so many years to live. How many, the years, the months, the weeks, the days, the hours, the minutes, the seconds. Every person's life is given to him and allocated to him literally down to the last moment. And no two people necessarily have the same amount of time allocated to them. What is the basis for the allocation? You know, if a firm gives one of its employees a task to do, a project to work on, and a project which normally takes a year, and they say we want it in 1 month, it's not possible. It's as qualified as that person may be, it's not possible to do it in a month. You need a year. What is the objective of creation? The objective of creation is to meet certain types of challenges. And if you succeed, the soul itself, which is the essence of the person, is able to achieve a level of perfection as it needs that perfection. And each soul has its own level of perfection which is needed. So certain levels of perfection you're able to bring about in 50 years, in 70 years. Some people need 90 years. So the amount of time you're given life-wise is because that amount of time is needed to be able to address all the needs of one's life, to meet those deadlines and the various goalposts that one has to achieve. So therefore, up to a certain point, person's a minor. So the value of his actions really don't have much value. There's no liability, there's no culpability, because a person until he becomes an adult, he's classified as incompetent. And because he's incompetent, there are no consequences as a result of his actions. So there's no liability to him. So really from the age of obligation, which for a Jew is the age of 13 for a boy and girl at 12, from that time going forward, that's when the clock starts ticking in a very, very serious way. Because every moment from that moment going forward has infinite value, because if you make the right choice, then you've achieved something which cannot be quantified, because it's in the spiritual realm. And that actually impacts on your level of perfection to be able to create this totality of who you're supposed to be. What happens if a person is able to achieve something in lesser time? Is it possible? I'm not sure it's possible. I don't think so, because God knows the reality of the future, and based on the dimension of the soul, more time is not necessary. And the time that is given is the amount of time which is needed. And God knows the challenges and all the actions that person will do, because God knows our choices. There's a question which is asked, which is not a question. If God knows the future, where does that leave place for choice? That's a question which is asked. If God knows the future, not only God knows the future, Rambam writes there's certain things, because we live within time and we're finite beings, we can't even relate to certain realities. If God is an infinite being, we speak about the future and the past. Infinite means there's no beginning, there's no end. He's not within the context of anything, because the moment we're able to quantify him, he's in the context of something, that means he has limitation. So to say he's infinite means there's no beginning, there's no end. If that's the case, the past, even after the past is over, the past still exists. And the future, even before the future comes, the future is here in regard to God. So God's in the future, he's in the past, and he's in the present. So when we speak about Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is the four-letter name of God, which connotes Hoya Hovaviyah, he was, he is, and he's in the future. It's not he was in the past. We're only using our terminology, he was, but he is in the past. He is in the present, And he is in the future. Not he will be in the future. He is in the future. Because otherwise, to say he will be, that means he's limited. He has limitation. He's not infinite. How do we relate to it? How could he be in the future if the future hasn't yet taken place? Rambam writes that something the human mind, because we live within time, it's not fathomable of us to even come upon that, to even process that reality. So God knows, if God knows exactly and even sees that you already sinned already, right? Where does it leave room for choice? I have no choice because God knows already my choice. It's not a question whatsoever. Each of us are given the ability to take initiatives to do right or wrong. And because it's our initiatives which bring about the right or the wrong, the action is attributed to the person. God being in the future or God knowing the future is unrelated to who I am. He happens to know what my choice will be, what my choice is. But in terms of myself, I am independent to dictate my future, whether it's positive, God forbid, negative, because that is the endowment of free choice. God knowing is unrelated to my own initiative. It doesn't in any way infringe or put limitation on my ability when I'm given full reign to do as I choose to do. But the amount of time, again, as I said, that's allocated to each of us is the amount of time which is needed to bring about that level of perfection. Now, what's interesting, so if a person, let's say, for the first 30 years of his life, he makes bad choices, negative choices, and those years were given to him to be challenged to make the right choice, and he made the wrong choice. Now that he has, but he only has a maximum to live. He was allocated 70 years, 80 years. So if he spent 80 years of the 30 years of the 70 years doing acts of futility, or worse than that, he only has 40 years. How could he achieve in 40 years what he was meant to achieve in 70 years? It's not possible. There's only one way to do it, and only God could do this. He offers you challenges during that last 40-year period that you're able to accomplish in that lesser amount of time what you would have accomplished in the 70 years. But you need special merit for that. That you need special merit. I'll give you an example. If one person has a certain capacity, but that capacity is to influence endless others, all the acts of mitzvah, which others do due to the influence and the encouragement of the one, all those acts, all those positive results accrue to that person who actually initiated and influenced those people. So we're talking about a person that influences 1 million people. That means, and they do good things. Those 1 million people, if they do good and it's traced to the one who had that initial influence and he was the impetus, that person has a share in all those good acts. And all those mitzvos, those good actions accrue to that person who made the difference. So if a person is privileged, after 30 years, he wakes up and he says, I have remorse for the years I wasted, and I want to make the best of my life. And he has true remorse, and he serves God at a very exceptional level. God may now endow him with opportunity, that the opportunity he has the last 40 years of his life is able to achieve the perfection that he would have achieved himself in the 70 years if he wouldn't have wasted the first 30 years of his life. You never know what God may offer you and may bring about. Because otherwise, it's so overwhelmingly depressive that here you wasted your life and you can't make it up. You can't make up lost time, but you could. You do tshuva, it's not held against you. Not only is it not held against you, when you repent, it's a mitzvah. But still, we have to achieve that special level of perfection. What did you generate in your life? Instead of generating 70 years of this mega spirituality, you only generated 40 years. But if whatever God gives you opportunity, where the opportunity, each one of those opportunities generates beyond that mega to make up for what you lost. And nothing's beyond God's ability and the times he does. Now, once we set down this principle, that the amount of time we have in life, we're only endowed that amount of time because that's the time necessary to achieve the goal. So let's talk pre-flood. Adam lived 930 years. That means he needed 930 years to bring about his level of perfection. In those generations, people lived 850 years. Endless lives, relatively speaking. Why did God give such extensive lives to these people? I mean, they chose to use it, to abuse it, and misuse it, and embezzle every moment with that, to use it to defy God, do against God, which ultimately led to the destruction of the world, which is the Great Flood. But why did God give them such lengthy lives? For what reason? So the Or HaChaim HaKodesh explains, based on the Zohar, that what is one's potential? One's potential is based on the dimension of the soul that he's endowed with. Initially, the souls that were endowed to each human being were mega souls. Today, a soul we have today is a tenth or less of those original souls. And because God saw that, because the finish line was so far off, it was 900 years off from the time this person was born, people lost sight of that goal line, and therefore they went off and they became corrupted and perverted and defiant. So what did God do afterwards? After the Great Flood, he says people no longer live 850 years, 750 years, 900 years. We're going to take that one soul and break it into 7 pieces, or maybe 8 pieces. As a result of this, the finish line is a lot closer. So when you're born, you know you only have 70 years to live or 80 years to live. So therefore, one's focus and cognizance of reality, of culpability, of reckoning is a lot closer. So the sense of accountability is greater because it's relatively sooner rather than later. It's not 900 years off, 850 years off, it's 750 years off. As a result of that, because man's inclination is evil, as the Torah says, God says, I will never curse the world again by bringing a great flood to destroy it. But simultaneously, he created a setting which the task is a lot easier. You have a soul that you have to perfect, which it'll take 70 years to perfect that soul. Because your soul is only a tenth of that original soul, or an eighth or seventh of that original soul. And therefore, the time allotted to you doesn't have to be 900 years, because those years only were allotted in greater numbers, because that was the amount of time it would take to perfect that special mega soul. Today, the soul is no longer that mega soul. It's a fraction, it's a sliver of that original soul. And therefore, you don't need as much time. That's their understanding. It says in the Midrash that originally Adam was meant to live 1,000 years. But factually, he lived 930 years. Why did he live 930 and not the full 1,000? So the Midrash tells us that after Adam was created, God showed him every human being that was meant to come into existence till the end of time, to see who will be his descendants. And then he saw a soul which looked very special, one of a kind. And he says to Hashem, who is that soul? Who is that special soul? So God says that special soul is only meant to live 4 hours, and then that child's going to die. It's not a viable human being. So Adam says, but that soul is so special. It's one of a kind of a soul. So Adam says to Hashem, I'm willing to give 70 years of my life to that individual, that soul should be able to manifest itself and actualize its potential. So Adam was meant to live 1,000 years, but he only lived 930 years because God, as a result of his wish and desire to give his 70 years of his 1,000 years to this very special soul. Who was that special soul? That was David HaMelech, King David. King David lived exactly 70 years. The day he was born, that's the day he died. And those years that he had, 70 years, were allocated to him, were gifted to him by Adam. So now we have a question. Adam was meant to live 1,000 years. Now he gives away 70 years. In 930 years, he can't perfect what he was meant to perfect in 1,000 years, because he was only given the 1,000 initially, because that's what he needed. So now that he gave his 70 years to the special soul who happens to be David HaMelech, King David, so how does he now perfect the soul which takes 1,000 years to perfect? His demise is going to come about at the age of 930. He needs another 70 years to perfect that soul, Adam. So how do we relate to this? The answer is, I think, what I would say, that we know that King David was the most special king in the history of the Jewish people. He was the holiest. He's the psalmist. He was almost worthy to be classified as a patriarch. That's how great he was. But if Adam wouldn't have chosen to give his 70 years of his 1,000-year lifetime to Adam, to David, there would have never been a David. So what was the value in giving away those years? That was his decision. The value of giving those years probably have greater years than what he could have accomplished during those 70 years. So therefore, the giving away is the equivalent of bringing back the perfection for his soul, because the end result, what David will do and what he represents, is the equivalent of what he could have done for himself, but even beyond that. So the level of perfection that he will achieve through David is no less than perfection he would achieve through himself, but maybe even greater perfection. Because nobody forced him to give away those 70 years. That was only his own initiative. We find in the Torah, it mentions 10 generations from Adam to Noach. And then it mentions 10 generations from Noach to Avram. When it speaks about the 10 generations in the Torah, it's very interesting. The Torah points out, it says, the person lived 890 years, and it says, and he died. So evidently, if he lived 890 years, it's evidently, if he's no longer alive, he died. But Torah says, and he died. And every one of these individuals of the 10 generations says he lived 750 years, and he died. And he died. Some said he died. If he only lived so many years, he died after that. And we know there's nothing superfluous in the Torah. When you read the generations from Noach to Avram, it says he lived so many years. It doesn't say, and he died. So the question is, and seemingly that's the right way to write it, because the word and he died is totally superfluous. Because if you only live so many years, it's obvious you die after that. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh says something phenomenal. You know, we speak about eras. There was this era, that era. These people were so outstandingly multi-dimensional. Each of their lives was the equivalent of an era. When the first person died, it was the end of an era. Because he had a level of representation, was so outstanding because of the dimension of his soul, although he chose to be evil. Doesn't make a difference. But he is that multi-dimensional person, which is nothing comparable to it. Once he passes away, that level of representation no longer exists in existence. Doesn't. Next generation. He lived so many years and he died. Meaning when he passed away, the end of another era. So the word "and he died" is to indicate it's the end of an era, and the next generation has no relevance to the level of the previous generation. After the great flood, where the world was minimized because of their previous misbehavior, and God broke the soul into multiple pieces. Because, as I said, because if the deadline is way off, hundreds of years off, the level of conscience and cognizance of responsibility is put on the back burner. You're too distracted. There, he lived so many years, it doesn't say, and he died, which is the right way to write it. So Reb Chaim Kosh answers, because there was overlapping. Each person wasn't a dimension unto himself, and when he died, it was the end of an era. And therefore, they just flow one into the other. It's all one continuous era, and happens to be comprised of all these different people who lived during this period of time. So the people lived pre-flood, these outstanding, unusual, exceptional people who lived these endless years, although they chose to be evil, but in terms of what their potential was, if they would have made the right choices, we're talking about unfathomable people. Not to be able to relate to what these people were. Therefore, each one was an era unto himself. Even though he was an evil person, he was an era. Today we speak about the era of the Tanoic period, the era of the Amoraic period. Those are the interpretations of the Mishnah. Then there's the era of what? Of the Gaonim. That's another level. The Gaonim were not at the level of the Amoraim, the interpreters of the Mishnah. The Gaonim, the great ones, like Rav Sadia Gaon, Rav Shrira Gaon. Then there is the era of the Rishonim, the early commentators. And then there's the era of the later commentaries. What's going to follow? Right now, we're in the era of the later commentators. It's because, again, as we say in English, they couldn't hold a candle to the people of the previous era. Not at all. They can't even argue with them. The basis for argument is, I understand what you're saying, and I disagree. You don't fully grasp the implications of what the person is saying, therefore you can't disagree. And whatever sources he based it upon, you can't even research them because you're so unaware of what they are. Therefore, a person of a later era cannot argue with a previous era. And Amora, the interpreter of the Mishnah, cannot argue with the Tana of the Mishnah, who's the personality of that era. And a Gaon, Rav Sadia Gaon, can't argue with an Amora in the Gemara, with the interpreter of the Mishnah in the Gemara, because he was another dimension of person. And that's the way it keeps going. What happens if a person is endowed with years, 70 years, and because he's not worthy, God takes his life early, passes away at age 50. Those years, which he was meant to live, what happens to those 20 years? God had allocated those years for life. Did they go into the dustbin? Because it only fits that person those years? Or do we say, no, the years now will be allocated to someone else? So the Talmud speaks about a case. There was a person, he oversaw the distribution of charity in the earlier times, the time of the Gemara. And his name was Binyamin Hatzadik. Binyamin, the devoutly righteous one. And he's distributing, and it was famine years. And he was the head of the communal charity. And this woman comes to him and says, could you help me to give me money to buy food for me and my family? He says, I'm sorry. The charity chest, all the funds have been distributed. It's totally depleted. I have nothing to give you. So she said to this person who is the guardian or the trustee over all this, the fund, she says to him, if you don't give me money to live, a woman and 7 children are going to starve to death. That's all she said to him. When he heard that, he took out of his own money and he gave her for herself and her children that they should be able to continue living. But in terms of the charity chest, the communal chest, it was all depleted. They gave it out. Okay? The woman continued to live, she and her 7 sons. Fast forward, the end of this person's life, and he comes up to, he didn't die yet, but he was on his deathbed. It seems to be he's not going to recover. And then there are advocates, angels that are advocates. They come before Hashem, they say, I think this person should have his life extended. Why? Because of what he did, the act, how he saved all these people, he provided for all these people. Not only that, when the woman came before him, it said that if you don't support me from your own means, I and my 7 children would die. And he did that. In that merit, he deserves to live. Not as the prosecution says he should die. He deserves to live. So the Gemara says, in the merit of doing what he did, they added 22 years to his life. Meaning the amount of time he would have lived, he was going to pass away when you ever go and prepay for gasoline at the pump inside. So they put into the commuter $30 worth of gas. When you come to about $29.75, that pump slows up. And it goes slower and slower until finally it just fades out. Stops working. That's the pump, right? You only have so many years. You're getting closer to that, the bottom of the well, so to say. The well is dry. God gave him an additional 22 years. Where did those 22 years come from? There's nothing ex nihilo. Does God have a fund called a year fund? And he takes the years from there and he tacks them onto a person's life? Evidently not, because the Talmud says if a person was meant to live many more years and the person passed away before his time because he wasn't deserving to use those years, there's a year bank. Those years, because those years were decreed, they should be lived. And since those years, nobody's going to live those years, it's put into a bank. And when a person is deserving that his life should be extended, God takes those years and tacks it onto his life, and the person is able to live beyond his years and even be more productive, because now he has years that are meant to be lived. And what is the capacity of those years? You go either way. It's the years of choice. Either you could choose do the right thing and extend your level of advancement, of perfection, or God forbid, you could use those years and diminish yourself. But so therefore, no years go to waste. No years become obsolete. No, there's no expiration date. You fly El Al, you belong to the Matmid Club. It's known that in 6 months, if you don't use those points, they expire. You fly other airlines, 3 years at least, and you can always renew them. They can always be reinvigorated. El Al points, dead in the water after 6 months. That's it. That's the way it is. Lahavdil. The years God endows a human being, those years are forever. They're held on an account. And if there's a person who's worthy that his life should be extended, they take some of those years to the degree that God wants to extend that person's life, he will give him those years. I always say, King David, Adam had seen his soul to be a special soul. Except God says he's only meant to live 4 hours because he's not a viable child. But since Adam had seen his ability and what he could accomplish, David Melech Shel Chai V'Kayim, there's no king like King David. Chai V'Kayim, psalmist, conquered Israel, purchased the location for the Beis Hamikdash, one of a kind of people. How did he succeed to such a degree? Nobody succeeded like David succeeded. Why? So what I said was, the years that David was given, which years were those? Those years were pre-sin years, not post-sin years. Post-sin, the souls were smaller souls. So the years endowed to people did not have the capacity to accomplish what Adam could accomplish. King David's 70 years, those 70 years, qualitatively speaking, could be the equivalent of 500 years, qualitatively speaking. Therefore, when David was given those 70 years to match that special soul, those years are able to address all the perfection that that soul needs. Because that soul was a mega soul, and you need those special years to be able to develop it and to advance it and actualize it. And only because they were Adam's years. They wouldn't have been Adam's years, it wouldn't have been the same end result. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Everybody should have a good Shabbos. To be continued.
Shabbos, Rabbi.
Good Shabbos, everybody. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom. Sunday morning.